dona eis requiem. Pie Jesu Domine, 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 dona eis requiem.
Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this is the new movie Diary, in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. So I saw the new Exorcist. It's called The Exorcist Believer, and it is the third direct sequel to the original 1973 film produced and adapted by William Peter Blatty from his own novel and directed by William Friedkin, and the third direct sequel to ignore pretty much all previous entries in the franchise besides the first film, because even by horror franchise standards, The Exorcist is a rather notorious, embarrassingly crappy series of films, which I got to have a crash course in when I sort of pub crawled my way through the entire poor man's excuse for a franchise in the days leading up to Thursday when I saw the new movie. The original Exorcist is, of course, a masterpiece, not only one of the best films of the 1970s, not only one of the best horror films ever made, but a horror movie that's so good that, quite contrary to the late director William Friedkin's assertion that it doesn't fall into the category of a horror film, The Exorcist is so good that it kind of makes it feel like it's the only horror movie, that any movie calling itself a horror movie coming after it is basically redundant or even irrelevant. The thing about The Exorcist, and why even the basic premise of franchising it is such a cynical and dumb idea, is that it's not simply a question of The Exorcist being a good horror movie. It's that even when you contextualize it in the period when it was released, coming out of the late 60s and going into the 70s, when we were about to see this explosion of really game-changing horror cinema that really radically redefined the genre out of the ghetto of being considered only alongside juvenile entertainment and low-budget exploitation, and actually being treated in the light of a legacy of visual art and dramatic screenwriting that we can now take for granted as being as legitimate as any other genre of story. Even in the context of that period, there is really no other way to describe Friedkin and Blatty's film other than as revolutionary. This wasn't just a film that was massaging the traditions of film horror that had prevailed for pretty much the last half a century and showing some new twists on narrative formulas or conforming to more modern experimental film language. The Exorcist was pretty much the first horror movie since the original Universal Dracula to completely redefine what a horror film was or could be, to be what we think of when we think of a horror movie. And to an extent that the film remains shocking because even now it feels ahead of its time, even now that this film has had the time to exert its iconic influence on so many filmmakers, it almost feels more shocking in terms of just how totally idiosyncratic and distinct it still feels as a vision of how you write and direct a horror movie. And look, I'm not necessarily the kind of guy who expects or even requires that a sequel to a lightning-in-a-bottle masterpiece like The Exorcist need to be comparably great, but I think even anybody whose opinion of the original Exorcist is not as fawning as my own is has to admit that the diminishing returns of the franchise have been consistently precipitous from the very start, with The Exorcist II: The Heretic from 1977 taking virtually everything that had made the first movie special, chucking it out of a window, and doing in its stead basically everything that would instantly date The Heretic as the landfill artifact of the 70s that it is. Setting the original film in a historically significant but charmingly unremarkable modern university town, well, let's set it in the hustling, bustling big city. Naturalistic, sometimes documentary-like photography with an emphasis on interior spaces that eschew the gothic or romantic cliches of horror cinema's past. Nah, let's go for decadent metropolitan apartments and offices resplendent in reflective surfaces and dynamic angles that we light so harshly that even the inside of a hospital ward for special needs children has the feeling and sentiment of a bespoke nightclub for coke-fiending celebrities. And why go for a more drawn-out literary approach to establishing character and teasing the unknown when you can just open with a screaming faith healer spontaneously combusting, work in a science fiction angle about the characters using a special device so that they can actually see into each other's memories, and then carry us off on a psychic journey aboard the back of a locust to some remote Ethiopian kingdom. And it would be one thing if The Heretic was simply garish, but it's also an excessively stupid movie. Like, this is the type of movie where a character tries to put out a fire by beating it with a wooden crutch. But at least you can say that The Heretic is at least certifiably insane. It's worth the price of admission just on the basis of how subnormally surreal it gets, whereas successive stabs at sequelizing and then prequelizing The Exorcist only got more boring. There are certainly some quarters where author William Peter Blatty's own attempts in the late 80s to create a spiritual follow-up more faithfully in keeping with his vision of the original film and novel are not only held in very high esteem, but even defended as comparable and perhaps better in some ways than the original. These quarters belong in an asylum because while there's plenty of things to like or at least find interest with in The Exorcist 3, particularly Blatty's far more successful attempts at surrealist horror, at least more successful than The Heretic, there's no getting around the stultifying boredom engendered by what turns out to be the dramatic centerpiece of The Exorcist 3, which are these long, protracted monologues delivered by a set-devouring Brad Dourif as an inmate in a mental ward, who is actually the spirit of a serial killer who has been recruited by the Legion of Demons who possessed Regan McNeil in the first movie in order to possess and apparently slowly reanimate the dead body of the priest who sacrificed himself to save Regan so that they can have revenge using him as a captive vessel for inflicting more elaborate killings. A concept that I think is just as mind-bogglingly stupid as anything that happens in The Heretic and is conveyed in the most phony and unatmospheric way possible. And in general, that's where pretty much all Exorcist sequels fall short. There are always some potentially interesting things about them, as various filmmakers have tried their hands at expanding upon certain details and themes of the original film and doing so in their own particular style, but nobody seems to have figured out how to render those ideas in a way that's actually atmospheric instead of just conceptually ostentatious, and furthermore, overly elaborated upon. That's certainly the case with Dominion, a 2004 prequel to The Exorcist directed by none other than Paul Schrader from a revised screenplay by historian and author Caleb Carr, which was fully developed, produced, cut, and then canned by producers Morgan Creek once they realized that they had spent just $30 million on a dialogue-heavy period piece featuring extensive location work and a large ensemble cast that didn't look like the kind of horror movie you'd release in theaters in the new millennium, but more like a cheap TV movie for the Sci-Fi Channel. Now, I will say that Dominion probably comes the closest among the Exorcist sequels to actually being a good movie, if not necessarily a good horror movie. But in spite of how generally low-scale the production budgets of all the Exorcist movies had been, the production value of Dominion is very visibly being stretched paper thin, and what with it being handled by a historically very idiosyncratic and conceptual filmmaker who was at the time still undergoing a kind of struggling stylistic transition himself, I can't say I terribly fault Morgan Creek for deciding that they just wanted to scrap the whole thing entirely and start again from scratch to make a more conventionally horrific, gorier, modern-looking, and action-packed film that tied in more explicitly to the original, the result being Exorcist: The Beginning. By default, The Beginning was the worst of the Exorcist films. It's certainly the one, shocking to say in light of The Heretic, that has the least in common spiritually with the original, but I will say that that doesn't make it as bad as its reputation, and as far as shamelessly gratuitous B-horror movies go, I would argue The Beginning gets some points because it has no pretenses of being anything other than what it is, and director Renny Harlin, ever a journeyman stylist, does manage to inflect his own vision of a modern exorcist with a poor man's pathos, a charmingly earnest attempt to deal, just as Schrader's Dominion did, with themes of imperialism and post-war trauma, albeit in an idiom more similar to more recent horror hits like The Ring or the Platinum Dunes Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake. What it all comes down to is that while lots of horror franchises have really undesirable legacies, and while they pretty much all have their peaks and their valleys, the Exorcist series might be one of the only ones I've ever sat through where I can confidently say that each one has gotten steadily worse than the last, with every entry slowly eroding away any interesting visual texture or novel ideas, so that really on the eve of yet another stab at reviving the internally decapitated corpse of The Exorcist nearly 20 years after The Beginning ate shit at the box office, I really have no choice but to be cautiously optimistic, or perhaps caustically optimistic is a better way of putting it, because it can't possibly get any worse, can it? Because even though this is a franchise where each interstitial entry has been so bad that pretty much every screenwriter or director attached to a new one has been content to simply ignore all the previous films except the original, there is an extent to which The Exorcist is distinct as a horror franchise, because even though it's clear that Morgan Creek is only interested in cranking out a new one every 15 years or so just so they can cling on to the copyright, it's distinct because what seems to attract filmmakers to The Exorcist has nothing to do with what tends to stitch together most of the other top-line horror franchises with this kind of longevity, which tends to be a particular character, or more especially an iconic horror villain or iconic horror setting. So you have to surmise that what keeps attracting screenwriters and directors to these sorts of projects is strictly the affinity for the original Exorcist film itself and a legitimate interest of playing in the sandbox of ideas and themes and concepts that the first film established. And in the case of The Exorcist Believer, you've got David Gordon Green, hot off the success of his legacy trilogy of Halloween sequels, coming onto this sequel reboot co-produced by Morgan Creek and Blumhouse Productions, working with previous Halloween collaborators Danny McBride and Scott Teems to come up with a story, and then finalizing a screenplay with Peter Sattler, the latter of whom also wrote and directed a really good indie war drama called Camp X-Ray from 2014. And I know a lot of people have a lot of mixed feelings about the new Halloween trilogy and David Gordon Green as a director. Personally, I only saw the 2018 sequel, so I can't comment on the rest of the trilogy, but I did think the 2018 Halloween was pretty good for a Halloween sequel, and while I myself tend to have some pretty mixed feelings about David Gordon Green as a director myself, I do do think it's fair to remark upon the sheer diversity of work he's done in his career, whether it was him starting out as a significant indie director of the new millennium who got a name for himself with such films as George Washington and Undertow, eventually pivoted somewhat into a string of mainstream comedies, beginning with Pineapple Express, to where he's been at for the past decade or so, which has been kind of keeping one foot planted in the realms of the more art housey side of things with stuff like Prince Avalanche and Joe and Manglehorn, or at least more middle brow dramas and comedies like Our Brand is Crisis and Stronger, the former of which, Our Brand is Crisis, is terrible, by the way, one of the worst and dullest movies I've ever seen, but then the other foot in a string of really much beloved continued collaborations with McBride and Jody Hill in the realm of television, whether we're talking about Eastbound and Down, or Vice Principals, or The Righteous Gemstones. His filmography is definitely a mixed bag that tends to identify him a little less like the auteur I think lots of people want and expect him to be, and more as a consummate journeyman who's been able to demonstrate a lot of flexibility as a writer and director and producer mostly, all of which leads him to being an executive producer, a director, and co-writer on this new Exorcist movie, and where there's plenty of reason to move away from caustic optimism to more of a cautious optimism, where you're like, well, there's at least a real chance here that somebody with this kind of background and variety of experience is going to be able to thread the needle somehow, where he's going to be able to make a serviceable horror film with a nice sense of spectacle and a visual panache to it, but where he's also going to be able to meet the project with a certain level of prestige and seriousness that should be owed to a sequel to The Exorcist. And I'll admit that for a good deal of Believer, I found justification for maintaining that sense of cautious optimism. The film opens in Port-au-Prince, Haiti in January 2010. We're introduced to two photographers, a newlywed couple, Victor and his pregnant wife Soren, played by Leslie Odom Jr. and Tracy Graves. They're on a honeymoon. They get caught in the earthquake that hit Haiti in that year. Soren is gravely injured, and the paramedics inform Victor that he will have to choose between saving his wife and his unborn child. They will not be able to address her injuries without terminating the pregnancy, and they won't be able to C-section the baby without Soren dying. We fast forward to the present day. Victor is now a single father raising the teenage daughter Angela, Lydia Jewett, in a comfortable Georgia suburb. Victor has some protective attachment issues. Angela doesn't have a lot of personal freedom. He's extremely reticent about even giving her permission to go to her friend's house to do homework. He's also very shaken and somewhat angry when he discovers Angela is wearing a scarf that she found among the late Soren's valuables. Still, he gives her permission to go to her friends as long as she's back by dinner. In reality, though, Angela is just using this as cover so that she and another friend, Catherine, Olivia O'Neill, can go out into the woods after school to a remote, ominous location for some obscure purposes. The girls end up going missing for 3 days, only to be discovered by a local farmer in a barn house with no memory of how they got there. And though there's no signs of lasting physical trauma or health problems, obviously I think we can all see where this is going, pointing in the direction of some kids performing an occult ritual and getting themselves possessed by demons. And for much of the first half hour or so of Believer, I was actually pretty pleased with what I was seeing. From the outset, there are some very obvious and rather tiresome allusions to the original film, which are sometimes about as subtle as when Victor photographs two dogs fighting while in Haiti at the beginning, to stuff about as obvious as Angela stealing sausage off her dad's plate and causing him to chase her through the house, not unlike Regan stealing the cookie and being chased by her mother in the first film. But besides that, I must say, I really do like a lot of the build-up in Believer. I think it has a really strong character foundation to it. It's certainly not as drawn out and naturalistic as the original film, but I think comparative to a lot of recent horror movies, there's a lot to appreciate about how Green and Sattler take a relatively long amount of time to establish an air of the unknown and really tease out the more mundane aspects aspects of the characters' lives than I think a lot of horror filmmakers really bother to do at all. And what it amounts to is what a very long line of Exorcist films since the original have lacked up to this point, which is actually a substantive sense of atmosphere and a mounting dread, even when nothing particularly ominous has happened or is being depicted. And in spite of what a lot of critics have accused Green and Sattler of, which is of basically being fans of the original film but not really understanding it, I think overall one thing you can't really knock Believer for is the idea that it's not engaged with what makes The Exorcist such a special film or what themes should resonate from it in any attempt to make a sequel, even this more indirect style of sequel. Case in point, I really like this idea in Believer of Angela ending up being a victim of possession despite the fact that she's been raised in an atheistic household. It very much tracks with that irony in the original film where Regan is similarly raised in a home without conscious religion or spirituality, but where there are bits and pieces of hints throughout the film that Regan herself has basically, without anybody else knowing it, come unto Christ, as it were, so to speak. That she's discovered religion and that's what makes her a unique, perfect target for demonic possession. It's not just that her soul is troubled by the more obvious stuff going on in the background of her life, that the film also doesn't really explicitly connect to her possession, like her estrangement from her father, or her possibly having been groomed and molested by one of her mother's colleagues. It's that she herself signifies in the Christian paradigm a figure of true innocence because she has accepted Christ voluntarily rather than being raised or indoctrinated within the church. And I think that's why Pazuzu, the demon or whatever, latches on to her. He's like, aha, finally a true believer. A true believer in this secular and empty world. And Believer is definitely more cliche relative to current horror movies in terms of not really being nearly as committed as the original Exorcist in terms of trusting that the audience will be fascinated enough by what they don't know about what's going on at a dramatic or character level in the story to interpret what the subtext of all the horror stuff is, rather than having the source of trauma being literally telegraphed to us in the very opening of the movie. I made this joke on Twitter to the effect of how a lot of horror filmmakers nowadays seem to write a lot of stories where the content is a lot like The Exorcist, but where, like, the story opens with Regan as a child watching her father beat her mother, and it just does not hit home as hard as when the supernatural aspect of the story is able to operate on its own terms, when we don't have a clear causal link to rationalize it, but where all of that stuff is still in the background of the drama. Even still, I do really like how Green and Sattler have keyed in upon that theme of a child unwittingly making themselves a vessel for evil, because ironically, they are looking for some kind of spiritual succor, and not only was it refreshing to see that that sort of theme was not telegraphed that obviously in Believer, as it would be in a lot of other horror films about possession, it was also really interesting to see the spiritual themes of Believer get teased out more and more and expanded upon into its own kind of exploration of the role of religion and spirituality in a very nasty and secular world. I especially like the idea of Green and Sattler also working in this threat of conversion, that it's actually Angela's friend Catherine, who is being raised in this very devout Baptist family, who basically leads this seeker astray into the occult. I thought that was a really nice, meaty, nasty little touch to the story. Unfortunately, though, after a relatively strong first half hour or so, Believer proceeds to take a dive right off the cliff, and right about the time where they manage to rope back in Ellen Burstyn chosen to reprise her role as Chris McNeil, the mother of the possessed Regan in the original film, who has now apparently written a book about her experiences and has basically become a recluse exorcism researcher. It makes absolutely no sense, and it makes even less sense how she ends up getting roped into any part of this story at all, and I have absolutely no shame in letting you all know that she basically serves no purpose in the story other than to get her eyes stabbed out with a crucifix by the possessed Angela, while Angela spouts a bunch of iconic Pazuzu lines from the first movie. It really is stunning the extent to which Green and Sattler go from what is at first a rather tasteful playing in the sandbox of ideas of the original Exorcist to absolutely one of the most shameless and embarrassing burlesques of it since The Heretic, and unfortunately it only gets even more dull from there. After a relatively positive start, Believer quickly reveals itself to be a convoluted mess organized around an ensemble cast that is way too big and where basically every theme is spelled out and explained specifically to us, and every trace of atmosphere basically evaporates as we plod our way along to the inevitable climactic exorcism sequence that has exactly two interesting conceits about it, one of which is this idea of a bunch of characters of different faiths coming together to perform a syncretic exorcism, basically throwing everything they can at the problem to see what sticks, and the second being the demons basically trying to get Angela and Catherine's parents to turn on one another, to trade one child's life for the other. But as far as I'm concerned, that's all just a cop-out. It's clearly done in a really ham-fisted attempt to create a universal exorcism narrative, but I'm sorry, if you want to portray a different kind of exorcism story than the one that's wedded to a specific religion, William Peter Blatty himself was a devout Catholic. You don't accomplish anything universal via this bumper sticker coexist bullshit. You do it by actually exploring and emphatically and charismatically portraying other kinds of belief systems outside of Christian orthodoxy, and more specifically outside of white Christian orthodoxy. And quite frankly, it's more cowardly that Green and Sattler clearly set up these individual pieces of a black exorcist narrative, not only with the casting of Leslie Odom Jr. in the starring role, but also with the opening in Haiti, and with the inclusion of the actor Okwi Okpokwasili as Dr. Bihibe, who is a practitioner of hoodoo that gets the obligatory sudden introduction and compartmentalized lecture about how the African diaspora has its own spiritual roots that have been taken away from them, etc., etc. It's a lot more cowardly to me to just pop these things into the narrative, but not really meaningfully explore them as alternatives to white Christian orthodoxy, rather than simply supplementary appendages to this makeshift multicultural coalition. It honestly would have worked so much better to focus the story around that idea, to cut out any of that bullshit where you just shoehorn in these ties to the original Exorcist and instead just attempt to weave your own anthological story dealing with similar themes, but from a wholly different spiritual perspective. Maybe play up the tension between Angela and Catherine's parents at a spiritual level over the course of the movie, where faith and their solutions to the same problem are pulling them in different directions and therefore threatening the lives of their daughters. I don't know. This just ends up being a classic case of a movie with some actually fairly interesting and neat ideas doing absolutely nothing of consequence with them, which has really been the story of every Exorcist sequel for a long time. Just a bodiless host of themes that never really seems to get an effective purchase, either because the production quality itself is subpar or because the writing just isn't there. I started out with that caustic optimism and that question. It can't really get that much worse, can it? And I have to say, in the final analysis, it did. it did somehow get worse, because while there's plenty to really like about how Believer starts off, where it ends up is actually somehow more dull than even much of Exorcist the beginning. This turned out to be by default the dullest Exorcist movie yet, and I'm pretty confident calling it by default the worst Exorcist movie yet. Decent production value will only get you so far. I'm giving this a 2 out of 5. Okay, so before I mosey right along to the second actually good, to say the least, movie I caught on Thursday as a chaser to Believer, I'd like to just take a brief aside to talk about, well, not a good film at all, but definitely one that I enjoyed a lot more and found a lot more consistently interesting than Believer, another religiously themed supernatural horror movie of the indie variety that found its way onto video on demand at the end of September, but I got around to at the end of last week for the Halloween season, at a time when, let's face it, the horror servings at the local theater have been surprisingly scant. I don't know if our cinematic culture is reaching a point where even around the weeks of Friday the 13th and Halloween, distributors feel more confident simply parlaying their stuff onto streaming instead of banking on the seasonal droves of teenagers. But anyway, the movie I saw was Deliver Us, co-produced, co-directed, co-written by, and starring one Leroy Coons, in which a Ukrainian nun named Sister Yulia, played by Maria Verarati, becomes pregnant with a pair of twins in an instance of what she claims to be immaculate conception. Coons plays an American priest and psychiatrist based in St. Petersburg named Father Fox, who is tasked with investigating Sister Yulia's claims, but instead becomes one of her reluctant protectors against a secret cult of Gnostic Christians who believe that her twins are destined to become the Messiah and the Antichrist respectively, thus signifying the end of the world. It's funny having seen Deliver Us in light of Believer, because besides coming off almost like a modern day version of those kinds of Euro trash exploitation films attempting to rip off The Omen, there's also a clear amount of influence from The Exorcist stewed into the pot of the screenplay that Kunz has co-written with his sibling Kane Kunz. In fact, when we're first introduced to Father Fox, it's in the context of a scene that could very well be seen as an inversion of our introduction to Father Karras in The Exorcist. What with both Fox and Karras being church psychiatrists and Fox himself also being an exorcist. Except that whereas Karras would have bemoaned the fact that his job was to assist the mental health of his fellow priests and Georgetown parishioners, but came to the conclusion that what they were really experiencing was a crisis of faith that he was ill-equipped to help them resolve, Fox's concerns are almost the opposite. It's that when we meet him, he's just coming off of facilitating an exorcism that he is confident was a poor substitute for meeting the needs of what he saw as someone experiencing profound mental illness better treated by secular clinical means. It should also be noted that Fox is also having his own crisis of faith, albeit of the more lurid kind, given that he has presently been carrying on a sexual relationship with a woman named Laura, played by Jean Kimmel, who is now pregnant with his child, and he's now convinced he must quit being, to paraphrase his words, a bad priest to focus on being a good Catholic, i.e., by quitting the priesthood and marrying Laura. The bishop to whom he's divulging these concerns seems remarkably unconcerned, even going so far as to say, quote, "Priestly celibacy is rooted in tradition, not Catholic dogma." Which is pretty much our first sign that the creative minds behind this film that will soon be playing fast and loose with a lot of religious imagery, including a lot derived from Zoroastrianism of all things, is not nearly as knowledgeable as they think they are. Like, just to make things clear, technically speaking, you can be a priest in the Catholic Church and be married, and this is more common in Eastern Europe than in the Western world. But the key is just that you have to be married before becoming a priest. Because once you become a priest, you are marrying the church. Celibacy is not just tradition, it is dogmatic. And the only workaround for if you're already married is that sex in the context of marriage is not a violation of celibacy, unless you have already made a previous covenant with God, such as becoming a priest. It would be fully one thing if the implication were merely being made about the internal hypocrisy and corruption of the Catholic Church as an institution, that at a certain level of power, nobody really cares about the individual hypocrisy of priests. But as someone who was raised Catholic and was in his youth even a rather devout Catholic, I would say that in the interests of good taste, you should know what you're talking about before writing a movie about Catholic characters, especially if it turns out your protagonist isn't just carrying on an affair with any random woman, but, as we learn, is in fact in a committed romantic relationship to a woman who is a wealthy heiress, who is publicly known. Even if the church is corrupt, that sort of scandal would appear, to me at least, somewhat meaningful even in the eyes of a corrupt individual. But all that basically goes to show that Deliver Us is a movie dealing in religious themes written from the perspective of individuals whose grasp on these things is about as coherent as spurious bar trivia. Hey man, did you know that, like, you could actually be married? Did you know that you could actually be married and still be a priest? Not a lot of people know that, man, but it's totally fucking true. That all turns out to be the tip of the iceberg for what proves to be an aggressively stupid movie. Nothing about Deliver Us makes the slightest bit of sense, even just in terms of basic continuity from scene to scene. This thing is barely being held together by Kuhn's and co-director Crew Enos's attempts at crafting a story that's more mind-bendingly surreal than logical, with fake-out dream sequences being in no short supply. I'm not even the type of person who's really anal about plot holes, but Deliver Us is the kind of movie that plot hole nitpicking was made for. And I'm not trying to give the impression that Deliver Us is even that entertainingly bad. It certainly got its long, dull stretches. But all things considered, I do feel like you're more likely to actually have some fun with its rather gobsmacking mix of trashiness and pretension, and I'll refrain from spoiling too many of its trashier and more pretentious highlights. That is, you're more likely to have fun with it in conscious, deliberate contrast to something as botched as The Exorcist Believer, because Believer starts out relatively smart for what it is and then just gets progressively dumber, whereas Deliver Us starts out really stupid and just gets stupider from there, and in fact might be one of the dumbest movies I've seen this year, so I'm going to give it a decent 2.5 out of 5. Not a bad choice if you and a couple of your friends have nothing better to do but throw back a couple beers and need something cheap and easy to complement your stupor for this Halloween season. But I digress. The real highlight of my last week at the movies is undoubtedly The Royal Hotel, which is an Australian psychological thriller starring Julia Garner and Jessica Henwick, coming courtesy of writer-director Kitty Green. Now, Green has been making feature films since 2013, but I first became familiar with her because of The Assistant, which was a drama that also starred Julia Garner as the junior assistant in the offices of a New York-based independent film company who, in between dealing with the day-to-day chauvinism of the company's totally male staff and the verbal abuse of her boss, begins to suspect that her boss is coercing another prospective younger junior assistant into having sex with him. The Assistant is already one of my favorite movies that I saw between 2019 and 2020, and The Royal Hotel sees Green tackling very similar themes, now albeit set against the backdrop of a titular isolated bar and hotel on the outskirts of a mining town in the Australian outback, where Garner and Jessica play Hannah and Liv, a pair of American backpackers who make a temporary work travel position as bartenders after their money runs out in Sydney. The movie is co-written by Green and Oscar Redding and is in fact loosely inspired by situations and events depicted in the 2016 documentary Hotel Coolgardie by Pete Green, which depicts the extent to which outback bars such as the ones in both films cater almost exclusively to the patronage of men who work in these mining towns and end up being cesspools of relentless sexual harassment and, of course, the threat of sexual violence, practically preying upon transient women who are all treated as potential conquests. The supporting cast is rounded out by Hugo Weaving as Billy, the alcoholic owner of the Royal Hotel who encourages Hannah and Liv to make themselves more amenable to the toxic behavior of his patrons, most of whom are, of course, close friends of his who often, as he does, drink practically for free. Ursula Jovic as his wife Carol, who is also the only person keeping the actual business of the Royal Hotel together. Toby Wallace as Maddie, a younger miner for whom Hannah begins to have ambivalent feelings of attraction and revulsion. James Frechville as Teeth, an introverted, nice guy who develops unrequited feelings for Liv and whose sensitivity proves to just be another mask of the uniform tactic among the miners to simply attempt to wear the girls down with persistence. And then, finally, and most threateningly of all, the highly unstable and downright sadistic Dolly, played by Daniel Henshaw, who many American fans of Australian thrillers will no doubt most vividly recognize from having portrayed the psychopathic John Bunting in Justin Kurzel's debut, The Snowtown Murders. Now, part of this might just be recency bias, and part of it no doubt has something to do with the fact that my immediate cinematic experience before seeing The Royal Hotel was The Exorcist Believer, but I have to be honest in terms of my immediate visceral opinion that besides being a taut, deeply uncomfortable, edge-of-your-seat thriller perfect for this spooky season, that I'm riding quite high on the vibe that The Royal Hotel might easily be one of, if not the best films I've seen all year. I pretty much have nothing even slightly negative to say about it. The direction, the cinematography, the score, and the performances are all excellent, but I think what it all comes down to and why The Royal Hotel works so good as not just a thriller, but at a deep psychological level is how trenchantly Green as a writer-director with a particular focus on Garner's magnificent starring role as Hannah manages to communicate the disquieting sense of uncertainty that comes with being a woman and being in a situation of even such seemingly cut and dry oppression and horror. And essential to that dynamic in the film is the duality between Garner's portrayal of Hannah and Henwick's less subjectivized but no less crucial performance as Liv. In these two characters, we see a really compelling duality of modern feminine consciousness, or rather simply a dual consciousness, that proves to be just as much a source of psychological tension as any of the more explicitly grotesque behavior of the men who they encounter. So much of the dramatic anxiety of the film plays on the extent to which Hannah is so immediately put off by the behavior of the men and the obvious threat of violence, and yet when she looks over to Liv, viewing her as we do as Green portrays it largely from the outside, we see a character who, on the surface, at least seems much more unfazed and even outright dismissive of Hannah's concerns, which only isolates Hannah more as she now begins, as we do, to start asking herself these understated questions about how much of this sense of threat is credible and how much of it is colored by her, say, perceptions as a cultural outsider. And what's brilliant about it is that Green even opens the film in a starkly different scenario where the sense of subjectivity and thus the tension in that subjectivity is almost completely reversed. The whole film starts off in a nightclub where Liv and Hannah are partying, which turns out to be aboard a small cruise ship making its way into Sydney. In the scene, it is through Liv's eyes that we see her losing track of Hannah, of finding Hannah being the life of the party, responding responding genially to the attention of some sweaty, drunk German tourist, making out with him on the deck of the ship. And it's here where we're introduced to a scenario in which one must be conscious of the fact that there is at least as much a threat of sexual harassment and violence, where there is at least as much of a culture of sexual conquest, at least as much of a dehumanizing spectacle of women as anything that occurs in the more viscerally repulsive setting of the Royal Hotel in the rural outback. But it's only once we reach the Royal Hotel that the roles suddenly reverse, and now Hannah looks on as Liv increasingly becomes perceived by these threatening minors as the life of the party, and Hannah becomes the only person standing between her friend and the threat and potential of a horrific violence that she can't prove is going to happen. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that I don't get the difference between young women just wanting to have a good time and women in general being victimized by a culture that is sexually predatory. What I'm saying, though, is that Green manages to so masterfully dramatize that psychological insight of how so much of being a young woman in the modern day can feel like you are only ever either on the inside of blissful ignorance or on the outside looking in and perceiving all of these horrific vectors of abuse and feeling like you are the only one standing in the way of things going terribly wrong. Because there is a sense of dual consciousness to being a woman in the modern age, in which you are at once keenly aware of the way sexism and misogyny saturates every part of our society, and yet at the same time are within new idioms of popular culture that also encourage us to imagine ourselves as somebody who is immune to these things. So once we get to the Royal Hotel, even Hannah's very perception of what is going on around her feels a lot less like the final girl virgin of a horror movie simply poo-pooing the good time that's going to get her train wreck friends killed by some cartoonish redneck psychopath, and more like another classic of the Australian thriller Wake in Fright, which similarly derives a tremendous amount of its sense of atmosphere and dread, not only from the way the more cosmopolitan protagonist is viscerally repulsed by the outback culture in which he's marooned, but also from that question of their own sanity in that context of not being able to escape from it. One could see the Royal Hotel as being almost like a postmodern feminist remake of Wake in Fright, with one of its most heartbreaking sequences coming not from, say, the horrid abuse Hannah experiences from Dolly, or the way the character like Maddie uses his drinking to excuse his gross misogynistic behavior on a night where Hannah gets drunk with, makes out with him, but simply doesn't have sex with him because she doesn't feel safe enough. One of the most heartbreaking scenes in this movie comes from an exchange between Hannah and Liv, where Hannah is trying to express how unsafe she feels to Liv, and Liv, far from validating her feelings, attempts to calm her with some pseudo-feminist bromides about what a strong woman she is. And then Hannah says, "I'm not strong, I'm weak, and I'm scared, and I want to go home." It's this really devastating diamond bullet of a line that signifies the point in the Royal Hotel where we are fully past the point of no return, where even if nothing else happens, nobody is coming out of this experience without being fundamentally changed by it. And nestled in that exchange, the realization that part of what Green so effectively mines as a source of thrills and horror in the Royal Hotel is not even just the chauvinism, not even just the sexual harassment, not even just the threat of violence. It is simply the dualistic psychological prison of being an indoctrinated woman, of knowing so intimately what it is you are afraid of, and yet being trapped in a scenario where you are constantly feeling like you need to justify this thing that you intimately know and fear. And where it often feels like there's nothing you can do but try to see it through and bear it out, and that, in fact, you are responsible for helping your friends get through it rather than everybody escaping it or fighting back against it. And I don't want anybody being too hard on Liv in this scenario. Trust me, she's going through a very fascinating, understated character arc in this movie that Green and Henwick portray with just as much nuance as Garner does with Hannah. And I will also say that part of what I think I loved so much about the Royal Hotel is that in spite of how disturbing and uncomfortable and dreadful things get, it is also at times deeply, disturbingly, darkly funny. There is a pitch black sense of humor that Green brings to her direction of this film that only crops its head up in very certain discrete moments, but which I think is carried off with such brilliance because you never feel like it's being done glibly or signifying disinterest in the seriousness of the subject matter. It's a rare, brilliant example of the deepest, darkest kind of comedy that is so unambiguously humanizing to all of its subjects. And I mean humanizing in the sense that you can humanize a subject without actually making them come out better in the end. Humanize a character like the awful chauvinistic men in this movie. Humanize them, but not make them look better. Like, actually take the human monster imaginary, the redneck slasher villain, totally out of the equation and just present the unremarkable, gross human nature of what's going on with them and their psychology and behavior. Where there's this humor that humanizes the subject but reinforces the seriousness of the film's themes rather than giving us a sense of catharsis or reprieve from the seriousness of them. Again, this may just be recency bias. This may just be the inelegant pairing of a film as crummy as The Exorcist Believer, but I'm pretty confident making The Royal Hotel my new favorite film of the year so far. A strong contender in what has already proved to be a really strong year for films written and directed by women, and feminist cinema specifically. I'm giving this one a perfect 5 out of 5, my first 5 out of 5 of the year so far, and my only 5 out of 5 in the short time I've been doing the new movie diary. I highly encourage you to go see this in a theater if you can. You will not regret it. An absolute tour de force as far as I'm concerned. With that, I'm going to happily wrap it up and in much better condition than when I started. Like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'll catch you guys next time.